Hey folks, tonight we're going to take a look at this book about ghost towns, gamblers, and gold. I'm not going to do the whole book in one episode. Written and photographed by Chuck Lawless. I feel like I've seen other books by Chuck Lawless, but I'm not sure. So I got this book in the free book list at the library. The free book pile from like friends of the library. I'll probably return it to the friends of the library set at some point. I'll keep it for a while as I check it out. So I think it has sections on California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. I think tonight we'll just look at the California one. And maybe do some of the others in the future. Let's see if this introduction is something good to read. We'll check it out. It's not too long. From the Rockies to the Pacific, from the border of Mexico to the Klondike, hundreds upon hundreds of ghost towns dot the American landscape, silent reminders of an age when men sought their fortunes with picks and shovels. It took the peculiar nature of mining, its boom or bust fickleness, to cause a town to spring up overnight. Oh, you know what? I think I'm going to take my watch off. It always clanks around, so I'm going to get rid of that. You know, with this book, I noticed several of the places they talk about, they refer to as ghost towns, but really, they aren't completely deserted, some of them. So a lot of them are, more like a pioneer town. They're kind of frozen in time, and maybe not, a major. They're not the heyday of its time anymore, but people still live there. And many are sort of tourist, based on a lot of their income is tourism, but they're not completely abandoned. Some of the ones they list here are, but so they use the term ghost towns a little differently than I'm used to. In a word association game, the word West usually elicits the response cowboy, but for every cowboy there have been 100 miners in the West. In the last half of the 18th century, the incredible mineral riches of the West were a far greater lure than its open ranges. The gold rush was one of the greatest mass migrations the world has ever known. It increased the population of California tenfold in a decade, and sent 4 million people to the West in 40 years. The gold rush also changed the flow of history. Despite its remoteness, California was admitted to the Union 4 years before Minnesota. Then there was the matter of the Western ethos, believed to have originated with the cowboy. According to the Western ethos, a man should be individualistic, taciturn, a loner, distrustful of government and big business, a seeker, not of security but opportunity, an existentialist. But all of these qualities fit a prospector as well as a cowboy. This is not an attempt to disparage the cowboys, but to focus some long overdue attention on the early miner who is in danger of becoming the forgotten man of the West. Hollywood is the villain for ignoring the miners and focusing on the cowboys. We grow up on a diet of cowboy movies, but there have been precious few movies about Western miners. Ghost towns, too, have been stereotyped by Hollywood. Most of us have an image of the quintessential ghost town. The setting is desolate, one street lined with false front buildings. The wood weathered a dark brown. Some buildings are crumbling, others stand at a crazy angle. A door is creaking in the wind, and tumbleweeds roll by. Ghost towns that fit this description are still around, but not too many. Most ghost towns are little more than sites, the partial foundations of buildings, the detritus of abandoned mines. Others are more grandiose, with soaring pillars, arches, domes, places with an exciting past but little present and no future. Finally, there are towns. Virginia City, Cripple Creek, and Tombstone are examples that live on in a fashion by making tourists believe they are something they stopped being a long time ago. In preparing this book, I visited more than 100 ghost towns in 6 states: California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, a journey of nearly 12,000 miles. The ghost towns included in this book are simply the ones that caught my fancy, the ones that excited my imagination. A purist might well question some of my choices. But this book isn't written for purists. This book is for those who haven't as yet had the pleasure of seeing in ghost towns the reflections of a fascinating era. Before setting out on my trip, I had thought I knew the West reasonably well. After all, I had been in most of the major cities of the West at one time or another, and had driven across the country 3 times. How wrong I was. It isn't until you spend time in the small towns and talk to the people that you can get the feel of the place. I learned that each state has a distinct look and character. Arizona and New Mexico are quite different, and neither of them resembles Nevada or California in the slightest. If this book stimulates you to go visit a few ghost towns, let me make some suggestions. First, get a local guidebook to ghost towns. There is at least one for every western state. Guidebooks give precise instructions on how to get there and what the road conditions are. Many towns you'll find can be reached only with a 4-wheel drive vehicle. Second, if it's a true ghost town, bring food and water. Certainly water if you're traveling in the summer. Third, watch where you step. Tumble-down buildings and junk piles are natural habitats for snakes. Finally, resist the temptation to collect souvenirs. Ghost towns are fragile things anyway, most of them well along the road to oblivion. As the saying goes, take only photographs, leave only footprints. So we'll start in this California section. The gold rush was on, the greatest migration the world has ever seen. It made some men rich, broke thousands of others, and irrevocably changed the course of history. So one thing this book doesn't have is sort of an overall map of where these different places are. I've been to most of the places in this book, but not all. Sutter's Mill. So this is distinguished from Sutter's Fort. They're not the same place. Captain John Augustus Sutter, a Swiss, founded New Helvetica. I always say that. New Helvetia on a land grant from Mexico in 1839, the first outpost of civilization in inland California. He built a fort near the Sacramento River, and one of his outlying enterprises was a sawmill. It is here on January 24, 1848, that his foreman, James Marshall, saw something shining at the bottom of the mill race. I reached my hand down and picked it up. He would recall, it made my heart thump, for I was certain it was gold. Marshall's discovery was ignored at first. A San Francisco newspaper gave it 4 lines on its back page. But Sam Brannan, who owned a general store near the mill, investigated and found gold there for the picking. He filled a bottle with nuggets and headed for San Francisco. Gold, gold from the American River, he shouted. This time San Francisco believed what it had heard and saw. Practically all of its 450 citizens dropped what they were doing and headed for Sutter's Mill. So that was before the gold rush. Note they said San Francisco had 450 people. California overall didn't have a lot of Europeans before the gold rush. For the first year, the gold rush was pretty much a local phenomenon. A group came from Sonora, Mexico, and some from the Oregon Territory, but most of the miners were Californians. In the East, the first reports of the strike were discounted. The government asked the Army to investigate, however, and liked what it heard. In January 1849, President James K. Polk told Congress in his State of the Union address the accounts of gold in that territory, California, are of such an extraordinary character as would command belief. The gold rush now had the blessing of the president. For the thousands upon thousands who headed west, there was no easy way to go. Indians, towering mountains, and 1,800 miles of desert awaited those going by land. It took 6 months to sail around Cape Horn to California. Some would sail to Panama, cross the isthmus on mules, and await another ship. But Panama was fever-ridden, and it might be months before another ship came. But come they did. Soon the waterfront of San Francisco was filled with rotting clipper ships. The crews had deserted and gone to the gold fields. In 1849, more than 100,000 people arrived to seek their fortunes. So we go from 450 citizens to 100,000 people arriving in San Francisco. So this is the reconstructed Sutter's Mill that's there. On the river. It's a state park now, and it's pretty easy to get to. It's right off the main road, or a main highway, and it's not like you have to go 4-wheel drive to get to this place. And there's a few little tourist attractions there. It's kind of cool. A few restored buildings and some remains. The town of Coloma quickly grew up around the mill. There were 2,000 living on the banks of the river within 6 months, 10,000 a year later. Coloma's Emmanuel Episcopal Church, this guy, was built in 1856 and presumably helped curb the excess of the miners. So the first people that came on the gold rush tended to be just the men. It often wasn't a whole family that came. So of course when you have a bunch of men and no women sort of keeping order, things can get out of control. They were pretty rough, these old mining camps. And when you have that much money to fight over. Old Sacramento. So Old Sacramento is now also a state park. Well, I should say there's multiple things. Sutter's Fort is a state park. Old Sacramento is. I also think the whole thing might be a state park, but it's one of these kind of restored to somewhat like that time, and it has shops and other things there, and you can do shopping and dining and things like that in Old Sacramento, which is kind of within Sacramento, the larger Sacramento. As the link between the goldfields and the outside world, the community founded by Captain Sutter became the nucleus of California's first great city. Shortly after gold was discovered there in 1848, Sutter's Fort was laid out as a town and its name changed to Sacramento. 2 years later, the first California legislature incorporated it as a city, selected it as the site of the first assembly, and in 1854 it became the state's permanent capital. Transportation was key to Sacramento's importance. Ships could bypass San Francisco and sail 67 miles up the Sacramento River and load at Sacramento's docks. Sutter's Fort was the western termination of the wagon trains of the early pioneers, and a few years later the Pony Express. The first transcontinental railroad, the Central Pacific, now the Southern Pacific, was begun in Sacramento in 1863 and completed 6 years later, an enterprise conceived and financed by 4 wealthy Sacramento merchants. No state ever grew with the speed of California, and it was the gold rush that was the impetus. There were fewer than 25,000 Americans in California when gold was discovered in 1848. The number had quadrupled in 2 years. The population was 380,000 in 1860, 560,000 in 1870, and 864,000 in 1880. Sacramento and later San Francisco were the prime beneficiaries of this growth. Men flocked to the gold fields to make their fortune, and a few did, but only a few. A much less risky road to riches was to have been a merchant selling food and supplies to the miners. Everything from picks, pans, and shovels to salt pork went for what the traffic could bear, and the traffic could bear a lot. Prices were outrageous. So this is Sutter's Fort, which is a state park in Sacramento. And like I said, Old Sacramento is kind of a little tourist area. It's kind of fun. It's got some, like I said, some shops and restaurants and things. There's a railroad museum there as well. Got this river ship, and I don't know if it has a little story about this river ship. I don't see it. I was curious which one that is. I'm not sure. The Motherlode. So the Motherlode was the whole area of this foothills of California, Northern California. And it goes from about mid-state up to mid-northern state. It's some 270 miles north and south along the foothills of the Sierra Nevada is kind of the area that would be known as the Motherlode. In the first 10 years of mining, the Motherlode yielded up to 600 million in gold. At the peak, around 1860, there were some 120,000 miners in the Motherlode country, but by 1873 the number had shrunk to 30,000. The game had changed. Big companies were tunneling hundreds of feet underground, and a large number of the individual miners left were Chinese, tediously reworking the leftover gravel. Many of the miners had come down from the hills and become farmers. Angel's Camp is another one of these small towns that has a old sort of pioneer section of the town. But it's still a town. People do live there, so I wouldn't classify it as a ghost town. Angel's Camp. 2 American writers took their first step toward immortality when they wrote about this wild and woolly mining camp. Bret Harte struck literary gold with Luck of Roaring Camp. Mark Twain with The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Both were classic short stories that captured the imagination. Bret Harte came to California in 1854 to join his mother, who had married a San Francisco man after his father died. Harte went to the mines in 1855, taught school for a while, and did a bit of mining. Mining camp life didn't appeal to the effete Harte. He confided that he found the Motherlode country hard, ugly, unwashed, vulgar, and lawless. Back in San Francisco, he became successful. He became a successful newspaperman, magazine editor, and writer. His distaste for the camps notwithstanding, Harte mined this literary load for the rest of his life. Mark Twain was 26 years old and still known as Sam Clemens when he accompanied his brother west in 1861. He tried prospecting in Nevada and California with no success. Worked on the Enterprise in Virginia City, where he first used the pseudonym Mark Twain, before moving to San Francisco in 1864. There he met Hart, who helped him find a publisher for his stories. Later that year, Mark Twain went to Angels Camp and stayed with a family that were friends of Hart. At the Angels Hotel, he heard a story of the jumping frog. By the time he left California the following year, he had collected material about mines and miners that he used the rest of his life. Unlike Hart, Mark Twain liked the miner's life. I know the mines and miners interiorly well as Bret Hart knows them exteriorly, he once wrote. Bret Hart was a master at creating character and mood in a few well-shaped sentences, but the American West had found its voice in the vitality and exuberance of Mark Twain. That's a statue of Mark Twain. Another church, picture of a church. Now, Colombia is another town in the Motherlode area, the foothills. And this one has been restored. I don't know if restored is quite right, but kind of maintained and upheld. And it's been a tourist town to sort of showcase what the typical mining camp might have looked like. And this is more than a camp, of course. These are small towns at that point. But so you can do things. We used to go there when I was a kid, and you can go on stagecoach rides and things like that in this town. And it has all kinds of things like that. And it has like a saloon and hotel and things like that you can do. And I think it is also now, Colombia now is also now a state park. It's run as a state park. In March 1850, Dr. Thaddeus Hildreth and his brother and some other prospectors camped on a rainy night in an area that was to become Colombia. In the morning, they decided to try their luck panning for gold. Before they were through, they had found 30 pounds of gold. The area was a geological oddity. A limestone bed full of holes had captured and retained the gold that had washed down from the hills over millions of years. Before the month had passed, some 5,000 miners were living in a town called Hildreth's Diggins. The town almost died when the runoff water from the spring thaws dried up, and there was no way to work the dirt. Soon there were only a handful of miners left, hauling the dirt to water some miles away. The Tuolumne Water Company was formed, and by the following April, a complicated system of ditches and reservoirs was bringing enough water to the site for a full-scale mining. The town, renamed Colombia, quickly grew to a city of 20,000, a population practically as large as San Francisco's at that time. 2 disastrous fires destroyed most of the early frame structures and were replaced by brick buildings. When sluicing, the use of high-powered hoses to wash away the limestone and extract the gold, was introduced, the brick buildings were torn down to get at the gold-bearing limestone beneath them. Sluicing did such a severe ecological damage that it was soon banned by the state. Colombia's boom days were to last 20 years, and what years they were. Edwin Booth played Richard III to an audience of miners at the Fallen House Theater, followed a few weeks later by Lola Montez performing her spider dance. There was an arena built for fights between bulls and bears. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, wrote about the fights, likening the contestants to speculators on Wall Street, terms which quickly found their way into the language. There's a little jail in Colombia. A lot of these towns you can pan for gold. They have little mock-ups where you can pan in a fabricated situation. There's a firehouse. There's kind of a classic box wagon. That's a pretty large wagon compared to a lot of the basic farm wagons that would have been common. Now here's a town I didn't know about. I've been in this area a lot, and somehow I managed to always bypass this little town, which I guess is off on a side road we don't go on too often. But Fiddletown, this is in California. Winter was approaching, but the miners, most of them fresh from Missouri, were too busy panning gold along the Cosumnes River to notice. Only when the snow started to fall did they think about their shelter more substantial than their tents. The winter was long and wet, and the cooped-up miners spent their time playing on their fiddles, such old favorites as Turkey in the Straw. When it came time to name the town, Fiddletown seemed the logical choice. I wonder if that story, how much truth there is to that story. Sounds like one of those mythology things, folklore. Fiddletown prospered through the years. It had 4 hotels, a brewery, and a winery. Like most mining camps, Fiddletown had a Chinatown with its own stores, medicine shops, houses, and opium dens. 2 colorful judges presided in Fiddletown. Judge Yates is remembered for an incident in one of his trials. A witness was playing fast and loose with the truth when the judge banged his gavel and shouted, "This court is adjourned." After a dramatic pause, the judge yelled, "This man is a damn liar." Another pause, and he reconvened the court. Judge Purinton found that when he visited San Francisco and Sacramento, people made sport of him when they discovered he came from a place called Fiddletown. Without consulting his fellow townsmen, the judge had the town's name changed to Oleta. A year or so later, when the judge had calmed down, the town changed its name back to Fiddletown. Fiddletown is a bit off the tourist trail, and is quiet most of the year. In the summer, though, it is host to a fiddlin' contest, and thousands of participants and lovers of country music crowd its main streets. One of the few surviving buildings of Fiddletown, this building here, is a bit worse for wear. At one time, Fiddletown had the largest Chinatown outside of San Francisco in California. Here's the general store. The general store has been catering to needs of Fiddletown for more than 130 years. Fiddletown was the setting for one of Bret Hart's stories of Gold Rush days, an episode in Fiddletown. It's an old International Order of Oddfellows building. Which I guess is this one up here. Yeah, I can see the sign at the top. And this one's the Butte store in Butte City. The store was built in 1856 and is now protected as a landmark. So Auburn is another one of these gold rush towns that, still exists as a modern town. I mean, it has modern things. Outside there's like an old town section that's sort of got the old style buildings, and then there's the rest of the town, which has like CVS and things like that, and Safeway and gas stations and whatnot. On his way to Sutter's Mill, Claude Shana, a friend of James Marshall, stopped at a ravine to try his luck panning for gold. The first pan yielded up 3 excellent nuggets, and in less than a week, a mining camp had sprung up. It was known by several names, before some nostalgic New Yorkers decided to name it after their hometown, Auburn. The surface gold was soon exhausted, but an accident kept the boom going. A miner had dug a ditch to carry water to his claim. The flow suddenly stopped, and he found that the water was pouring into a gopher hole. The bottom of the hole was covered with gold, $40,000 worth as it turned out. A switch to hydraulic mining kept the Auburn mines productive for another decade. A second town developed above the ravine. This was fortunate because a fire in 1855 took 25 minutes to destroy the old town. It was also a transportation center. Trails led from mining camps in the Sierra, and in 1865, the Central Pacific was routed through town. Auburn had too much going for it to become a ghost town. Probably because that train line went there and the main road stayed nearby. It was able to continue as a town. That's probably a big factor. After the disastrous fire in Auburn, the town was rebuilt in brick, producing some priceless examples of Victorian architecture. Grass Valley, another one of these towns that is sort of a historic town and also a place where people actually live. Grass Valley emerged from the early gold rush days as the most important gold mining town in the state, primarily because it was here that hard rock mining techniques were introduced and developed. At Grass Valley, mining changed from a hit-or-miss business of individual miners into an industry. For this reason, there was no boom and bust cycle here. Grass Valley grew throughout the last half of the 19th century as the Empire, the North Star, and other mines in the area prospered. In the process, it became the commercial and social center of the northern mines. But for anyone with romance in his soul, Grass Valley was, first and foremost, the home of Lola Montez and Lotta Crabtree. Born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland, Lola Montez charmed Europe with her singing and dancing, and scandalized Europe with her 2-year affair with Ludwig of Bavaria. She was famous for her parties. Alexander Dumas, Franz Liszt, and Victor Hugo were among her frequent guests. On an 1852 American tour, she was not well received in California and decided to retire to Grass Valley. It was to be an active retirement. She kept monkeys and grizzly bears for pets and resumed giving her famous parties. One day, Lola met and was enchanted by Lotta Crabtree, a 17-year-old girl who lived nearby. Lola took Lotta as a protege, teaching her songs and dances. The Crabtrees moved away the next year, but Lola had done her job well. Lotta started performing in a saloon at age 8, and the miners showered her with nuggets. She toured the camp for years, became a success in San Francisco, New York, and the continent. Lotta Crabtree retired at a comparatively young age and continued to live well. When she died in 1924, she left a $4 million estate. Lola Montez did not fare as well. An Australian tour in 1855 was a flop. She returned to America and tried the lecture circuit, but failed again. She died nearly penniless in 1861 at the age of 43. This is the view from Lola Montez's house, front door. That's a little church in Grass Valley. Rough and Ready. I think Rough and Ready is another one of these ones that is now a state park. Most of the miners who settled here had served in the Mexican War under General Zachary Rough and Ready Taylor, so they named the town after him. It was founded in 1849 and thrived for 20 years, but its moment of fame came in 1850. The United States had passed a miner's tax, and the territory of California had announced its intention to collect it. When news of this reached Rough and Ready, it seemed just the sort of thing that had cramped the miners' lives back east. After some heated discussion, they voted to secede from the territory in the United States and form the Great Republic of Rough and Ready. But how could the Great Republic of Rough and Ready celebrate the 4th of July if it was a separate country? The miners voted themselves back into the Union. Sounds like there's more to that story. The Empire Mine. The story goes that a miner named George Knight was out looking for his cow one night when he stumbled his toe, knocking loose a rock near the Boston Ravine. Particles in the rock glittered, so George took it to be assayed and found that it was the gold-bearing quartz, the first to be found in the Motherlode country. Within a few years, hundreds of miles of tunnels were dug around Grass Valley in Nevada City. The era of hard rock gold mining in California had begun. The prospectors worked independently in a boom or bust atmosphere was the rule in mining camps. If prospectors were working independently in a boom or bust atmosphere was the rule in the mining camp, the Empire Mine was one of the few notable exceptions. The Empire, the oldest, largest, and richest gold mine in California, operated continuously from 1850 to 1956, and probably wouldn't have closed if the price of gold hadn't seemed permanently fixed at $32 an ounce. The Empire employed as many as 800 miners at a time who worked in shifts and who over the years dug 5.8 million ounces of gold out of the mine's 367 miles of tunnels. In the early days, Cornish miners were brought from England to help develop hard rock mining techniques suitable to California and to train inexperienced miners. Miners were lowered into the mine on cars. One descent covered a 4,000-foot decline in 4 minutes. In the tunnels, quartz was dug out of the vein with picks and shovels and later jackhammers, and brought to the surface in mine cars, where it was pulverized by 84 huge stamping machines, each with 1,750-pound stamps that slammed down 104 times a minute, an ear-splitting racket that could be heard miles away. I don't know if they have a picture of what those stamps look like there. It's a big, impressive machine. You can imagine how loud it was. I think they have one that runs occasionally, and they run it for a short time just so you can hear how loud the thing was, but that might not be true anymore, but I seem to remember that. And they would just smash these rocks. The pulverized ore then was passed over amalgamation plates that trapped the gold with mercury. The mercury was removed by retorting. The gold was then melted and cast into bars. A later refinement increased the amount of gold taken from the quartz to 90% by using cyanide to recover more gold from the residue of the amalgamation. The Empire Mine now is a state historical park, and a visit there is an excellent introduction to hard rock gold mining in all its size and complexity, and a reminder of the wealth it produced. There's a small museum and a 2-mile trail through the mine's 784 acres. Looks like we can maybe finish up with a few of these and maybe skip Death Valley for tonight. So here's a list, or here's some Motherlode towns. In addition to the Motherlode towns featured in these pages, there are others of particular interest, both historically and aesthetically. They are listed here geographically south to north. Hornitos, Mexican miners founded this town after they were forced to leave nearby Quartzburg. The legendary bandit Joaquin Murrieta is said to have made Hornitos his headquarters. Murrieta swore vengeance against his American prosecutors after they beat him, raped his wife, and murdered his brother. He was a Robin Hood of the southern mines in the 1850s. Many historical markers mention his name, but fact and fiction have been hopelessly entwined. Chinese camp. In early 1850, some 5,000 Chinese miners settled here, and a minor incident at the mines was later to ignite into a Tong War. A large stone happened to roll from the diggings of one group of miners to a spot where another group was working, and a fight started. Each group was allied to a San Francisco Tong, and each sent for reinforcements. On October 25, 1856, 1,200 members of one Tong faced 900 of the other. All were armed. In the melee, 4 were killed and 12 injured. American law authorities took 250 into custody. Honor had been upheld, and everyone returned to the mines satisfied. Sonora. Sonora's a nice little town in this Motherlode area. Bad blood between Mexican and American miners marked the early days of Sonora. A statewide $20 a month tax was levied on all foreign miners. The Mexicans left, cutting Sonora's 5,000 population almost in half. Business suffered until the tax was repealed and the foreign miners returned. Sonora was the richest of the southern mine towns. In the 1870s, 3 partners bought a supposedly played-out pocket mine from a group of Chileans. Long digging brought the new owners to a vein of almost solid gold. Within a week, more than $500,000 in gold was mined and shipped. Placerville. 3 great American fortunes trace their beginning to this early mining camp from 1853 to 1858. J.M. Studebaker built wheelbarrows in his Main Street shop. When he had saved $8,000, he went home in South Bend, Indiana, and with his brothers built the largest covered wagon factory in the country. 2 of his Placerville tradesmen were Philip Armour and butcher and grocer Mark Hopkins. Placerville was first known as Dry Diggins because water was in such short supply. In 1849, the name was changed to Hangtown after a series of hangings, then became Placerville in 1854. After the mines were exhausted, the town became an important stage stop, and commercial center for the northern mines. Yankee Jim's. Yankee Jim wasn't a Yankee at all, but an Australian and a horse thief. He pretended to be a miner, but concentrated on stealing horses. He kept the horses he had stolen in a corral on a high mountain ridge. One of his victims discovered his horse in the Yankee Jim's corral and went for the law. Yankee Jim escaped, and in a bit of poetic justice, the corral was found to be on a small fortune in free gold. Named after the departed horse thief, Yankee Jim's grew into Placer County's largest mining camp. Nevada City. Nevada City is up near Grass Valley, which we talked about a little while ago. Nevada City was one of the first of the gold rush mining towns and still is one of the most charming. It abounds in quality Victorian buildings of historic interest. At Ott's assay office, for example, James Ott assayed the first samples of what was to be the Comstock lode at Virginia City, Nevada City. Nevada City was also the first gold rush town to see Madame Eleanor Dumont, known later as Madame Mustache, the lady gambler. She stepped off the stage here in 1854, a comely young lady with good manners, and proceeded to open a blackjack parlor. When the mine started to fade, 4 years later, she started to move around the camps. Her beauty was beginning to fade, and she had acquired a line of dark fuzz on her upper lip that gave her the cruel nickname. In Bodie, 25 years after she first arrived in Nevada City, she committed suicide. Altaville. For a town that had so many names, there isn't much left to look at. Altaville, previously called Forks in the Road, Winterton, and Cherokee Flat, is primarily remembered as the scene of a hoax. A skull was found in the area and was presented as that of a prehistoric man. 4 years, the scientific community debated its authenticity. Finally, it was determined to be the skull of a contemporary Indian, and the whole affair had been an elaborate practical joke. Bret Harte immortalized the incident in his poem, To the Pliocene Skull. Mocklemny Hill. Violence was commonplace in Mock Hill, as the town was popularly known. 5 people were killed in 1 week, and once for a 17-week stretch there was at least 1 murder every week. Mock Hill also had the distinction of having two foreign wars. The first was with Dr. Concha of Chile Gulch. The doctor, a Chilean, was using countrymen as slave labor in his mines and had registered illegal claims under the names of some of his peons. The men of Mock Hill ran Dr. Concha out of town. A few years later was the French War. French miners were successfully working a claim in the nearby hills and made the mistake of flying a French flag over their diggings. That and greed were sufficient pretexts for the mock miners to drive out the French and claim the mines as their own. Volcano. There never was a volcano here, but a natural cup in the mountains gave the mountain its name. Mexican war veterans from the 8th New York Regiment struck gold here in 1848, and a town quickly grew up around the diggings. The area was to produce 90 million in gold before the boom was over. Still on display in Volcano is Old Abe, a cannon that played a role in the Civil War. When Southern sympathizers threatened to divert gold to the Confederate cause, Union volunteers wheeled out Old Abe. There were no cannonballs in town, but they had a supply of round river stones. The Southern sympathizers gave up before a shot was fired. Volcano had the first public library in the state, the first astronomical observatory, and the first debating society. I did not know those facts. Murphys. John and Daniel Murphy settled the area in July 1848, and the town grew into one of the most charming on the Motherlode. Murphy's Hotel, built in 1855, welcomed such guests as Ulysses S. Grant, J. Pierpont Morgan, and Thomas Lipton. About 20 miles north is the Calaveras Big Trees State Park, a magnificent stand of sequoias. Jackass Hill. The braying of the hundreds of mules tied up at this location gave this mining camp its unusual name. Mark Twain lived in a cabin here for 5 months, writing, among other stories, the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. The Twain cabin is a popular visitor attraction. Dry Town. Temperance had nothing to do with naming this town. It just happened to be on Dry Creek. Founded in 1848, Dry Town had a good 9-year boom before a fire leveled it. Some of the original brick buildings have survived. Nearby is the site of Lower Rancheria, a Mexican and Chilean mining camp, the scene of a massacre in 1855 by a gang of Mexican bandits. A monument marks the mass grave of 12 killed in the massacre. North Bloomfield. A hard-drinking, garrulous old prospector who used to talk miners into coming here with his tall tales gave the town its first name, Humbug. The town has been restored and now is part of the Malakoff Diggings State Park. A number of buildings are open to visitors: the general store, post office, blacksmith, and the fire station. At the state park are examples of what the huge hoses once used for hydraulic mining can do to the environment. Hydraulic mining caused erosion, flooding, and killed the fish in the streams. Such mining was banned by the state, but not until a lot of damage was done. Ironically, the area today is strangely beautiful. So I think we'll finish tonight before and not jump into Death Valley. So we covered California gold rush towns, especially that main early period gold rush, not sort of the subsequent rushes for silver and gold elsewhere in other parts of the West. So I hope you enjoyed this little presentation of ghost towns, gamblers, and gold. Found it relaxing. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. Always subscribe to the channel. It helps me out. If you're not a subscriber, if you're already a subscriber, thank you very much. And most of all, thanks for watching. We'll I'll see you next time.